If you've got a scene to film, there are a lot of different things you have to take into consideration, whether it's composition and framing, movement of the camera, blocking of the actors, or one of the most important ones is exposure and making sure you're getting a proper exposure for the light that you're using. And what I like to do is I like to start with the very basics: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO or ISO. And the reason this is so important is because it's the fundamentals, it's the building blocks for everything else you're going to do. And so what I like to do is start with shutter speed, because when you're doing video or film, you're usually locked. 99% of the time, you're going to be shooting with a shutter speed based on your frame rate. Video doesn't have the same luxuries as photography, where you're just worried about eliminating motion blur. For video, there are some hard rules to follow when considering shutter speed or shutter angle. And the reason for that is because film cameras traditionally, rather than having an electronic or mechanical shutter like we do in DSLRs, it was actually a rotating disc, and half the disc was blank for the exposed film and the other half was solid to prevent that half from being exposed. And this disc would spin around, and so you had what was considered a 180-degree shutter. And that could be adjusted based on the disc, but typically it was 180 degrees. So for the duration of a single frame, half of it would be getting light, and the other half of the time period, it wouldn't be getting any light. So it's only getting exposed for half of that frame. So when you relate that to DSLR filmmaking, or any kind of modern digital filmmaking, you have shutter speed or shutter angle. Shutter speed is more of a photography thing, but you can do it the exact same way. Essentially, you set it to 1/2 times your frame rate. So if you're familiar with, what a lot of people do, they usually set it to like 1/50th of a second if they're shooting 24 frames, 1/60th of a second if you're shooting 30. 120th of a second if you're shooting 60 frames a second, and so on and so forth. 1/2 times your frame rate. And if you have a camera that does shutter angle, that's a little bit nicer, because you can just set it to 180 degrees and not have to worry about it. It does all that math for you. So it'll update your shutter speed essentially based on the frame rate you're using. So usually when I walk into a set, I know the frame rate I'm shooting, whether I'm trying to do any high speed, over crank, under crank, anything like that. I know my frame rate, and so therefore I know my shutter speed. And so I can just set it, with right now I'm using a GH4 for most of my work, and I can actually set a shutter angle on that camera. So I just set it to 180 degrees, and I set it and I forget it. So then, because that component of my exposure, my shutter speed, is locked away, I can't change it, unless I want to change my frame rate, which I probably don't want to. I have to move on to aperture as being the next determining factor in setting my exposure. But the thing with aperture is, because it's so connected to depth of field, and that is such a key important part of your image, usually you're going to have an f-stop value in mind that you want to set that to. So whether it's f2.8, 5.6, f11, whatever it is on the lens, you can kind of probably imagine what you want in focus. Whether you want a narrow depth of field, so you get a lot of that background blur, some nice bokeh, or if you want a lot in focus, you'll kind of know that going in, depending on the scene. Typically for close-ups, you're going to want a shallower depth of field, or more, depending on your particular image. But I'll usually have that set in mind, and I'm probably not going to be filming wide open, because I want that optimal, crisp, sharpest part of the lens. So I usually stop down a stop or two to get the best image from that lens. So usually, for a lot of work, it's f2 or 2.8. So I know that component of my exposure. The only thing left is ISO. And setting my ISO is just a matter of what light's available. What do I have in this room? Okay, so I've got maybe some lights set up. I've got my key light, I've got my fill, I've got my edge. And if I have to set to like ISO 200, and that's a really good exposure, and I can just look right on the monitor, even use a light meter if I want, or just go by the histogram. Once I have that good exposure, I know, okay, my lighting is set, and all I really need to do is tweak positioning. But maybe your ISO is 1600, and it's really noisy, and you still need a brighter exposure level. Well, that's when you have to start considering adding in more light and supplemental lighting. But usually, if I've done my job right, I've got my light set in such a way that I can shoot with ISO 200 or 400. There are other times where maybe you're shooting outside in bright sunlight and ISO 200 or 100, or even some cameras go down to 50. You can't get low enough to get a good exposure. It's still too much light in the scene. Well, that's when you have to start worrying about ND filters and additional, maybe it's diffusion or scrim to knock down some light in the scene. But if we're just going to keep things simple and talk about, practical lights or lights that have been set up, that you're plugging in and you have control over it, that's where when you're looking at ISO 200 or 400, you're probably in a good range. If you have to go higher than that with your ISO to get a proper exposure, you might want to consider adding in some additional lighting, because even though a lot of people don't think this way, if you have a scene that you are intending to be dark and moody and you want a little bit more atmospheric, you want it kind of dramatic, you still need a proper exposure on that. And then what you're going to do is bring down that light level in post-production. So as long as you're not overexposing anything, you can bring that down and have a much cleaner image, noise-wise and color-wise, than if you're shooting, ISO 1600, 3200, or even really high. There's some cameras like the A7S, for example, that can go to ridiculously high ISO levels, but you don't want to shoot that way most of the time. There are times where you're limited because you don't have lights, and so those cameras are really good in those situations where you can't control it, whether it's like at a wedding or a concert or some kind of documentary filmmaking. But if you have control over the light, your ISO and your lights are going to do this little dance, because, like I said, your shutter speed and your aperture are probably locked. So even though those can affect the exposure, it's a lot different from photography where you're using ISO, aperture, and shutter speed all interchangeably, and you can kind of tweak shutter speed or aperture or ISO a little bit between the two. Most of the time for video, you're locked. Your shutter speed and your aperture are set the way you want them set, and so it's really just that ISO that is affecting the exposure of your image. So as long as you have enough lights to shoot with a low ISO, you should be good.